Uh, oh, thank you. Thank you. Um, most of us think every company should be, have some form of agility and some form of adaptability and so forth. So, big companies, it's difficult. So we started this community many years ago to talk about techniques and practices and experiences to do that. So Ron is one of the founding members, and so he's graciously um, volunteered to discuss this subject. He's volunteered many times over the years to discuss important practices and material that we can all use practically. So I will turn it over to my friend Ron.
Okay, and let me, whoa, I was going to say, let me bring up this slide. There we go. Let me bring up the slides. And what we're going to talk about over the course of tonight is 5 practices. So we're going to talk about 5 practices that promise more, and when subtly nuanced, deliver a ton more. So these are the 5, and the first one is actually not a practice. First one, not just doing Agile, talks about not just doing practices. So we're going to talk about values and mindset, values and principles and mindset first. That's the first one, and then we'll talk about 4 practices after that. So jumping into don't just do Agile. I want to note that so as you can see, this is my 5th book, Managing the Unmanageable, and in the center section of it are a set of rules of thumb and nuggets of wisdom. There are, I mentioned this a minute ago, that there are 300 rules of thumb and nuggets of wisdom in the center 40 pages of the book. But the one rule of thumb that overall that overrides them all, the one ring that wins them all, the one rule of thumb that overrides them all is this one: software development is a team sport. And I fundamentally believe that software development is a team sport, and this evening is really about making our software development be about teams. And so when we talk about teams, and the reason I wanted Jay to get the chat up here was because I want to do something called a chat storm. So for those of you who've never participated in a chat storm, the way it works is I'm going to give you a question, and I want you to type your answer into the chat, but don't press enter. Don't press enter. Don't press return. If you got more to say, then put a period or semicolon and continue writing. But watch that little finger that reaches for the return key, and don't do that until I give you the signal. So the question is, I want you to think about the best team that you've ever been on, the highest performance team you've ever been on. Some probably those two are the same thing. Best team you've ever been on. What were the characteristics or the relationships or the qualities or the ways of being that made that team stand out, that made that the best team that you've ever been on? And type your answer into chat, and don't press return until I give you the signal. And I'll give you a minute or so to think through all of the teams you've ever been on for that best team and what characterized it. I'll give you 10 more seconds. All right, when you're done with your thought, press return or enter. And let's see what we've got here. So, outstanding communication, transparency, continuous improvement, vocal, intelligent, varied perspectives, high trust and high engagement, humor, fun, challenges, lovely people. I want to note that I've over I don't know dozen or more years I've been giving talks on the subject of software development. I ask this question once in a while, and I want to note that there are two words that always come up, and trust, that's one of them. They were very open to new ideas, very knowledgeable, different skill sets. Everyone respected the other skill set. Respect is the other word. So trust and respect, inevitably, in every single one, every single time I've done this, the words trust and respect come up. Humility, partnership, openness, the current team. So if you don't know this, in the hamburger menu at the bottom of the chat, you can save the chat. There's a way to save the chat off. So if you want to save off, what all of us have shared here about best teams, you can do that, or you can save that chat at any particular moment. We'll have a couple more chat terms as we go along. So as I said, trust and respect always come up. And I also hear characteristics like shared goals and my teammates had my back and psychological safety and a ton more in those vein. So I've been involved in Agile since 1999, and I've been on discussion groups. They were back in the day, there were Yahoo discussion groups and Google discussion groups, and now they're mostly LinkedIn discussion groups. But discussion groups around Agile values and practices and those kinds of things. And every once in a while, somebody will post something that says, well, Agile practices are worthless unless you've got the Agile mindset. And I saw enough of those that it led me to think, well, do Agile practices deliver value without the right mindset? And so I want to address that up front, because I quickly listed this set of Agile practices. Just it's a random set. There are way more than that. It depends on what you do. There's write tests before writing implementation. That's TDD, which you may or may not do, depending on whether you're doing XP. You may do sprint planning if you're doing Scrum. So, but some random set of ones that came to mind, and I looked down this list, and I thought, every one of these has value. Practice just by itself has value. And it led me to say, okay, so Agile practices do deliver value. There's goodness here, but and then I want to shift to a metaphor, which some of you may have heard me use before. Yesterday was election day in the United States, and I voted in my precinct. And we see voting and voting machines. Voting is a practice. Voting machines are tools, and they deliver value. But do voting and voting machines make us a democracy? Fundamental question. No, because we all know of countries that do voting where the leader of the country jails his opponents, or the leader of the country poisons or even kills his opponents, or where going into the voting booth, you come out and show your ballot to somebody who approves it or sends you to jail. Far cry from democracy, those countries. Voting and voting machines don't make us a democracy. Democracy emanates from values and principles. Voting is a practice that supports our being a democracy in the United States. Voting machines are tools that support voting, that support us being a democracy in the United States, but they by themselves don't make us a democracy. And similarly, Agile practices don't make us agile. Agile practices only deliver better outputs. That list I gave you, every one of them, I think, delivers better outputs, but they don't deliver great teams. And great teams are inspired by Agile values. And let's go to some Agile values. Here's the Agile Manifesto. Here are a few sections from the Agile Manifesto. Build projects around motivated individuals. Trust, there's that word again, trust to get the job done. Face-to-face conversation, self-organizing teams. The team reflects and tunes and adjusts. So look at self-organizing teams. And let's look at just that one for a moment, because I think it's one of the ones that's hardest to get our arms around. And so I want to do a chat storm around self-organizing teams. So type into the chat, don't press enter, don't press return. Type into the chat a word or phrase that describes what's essential to you about self-organizing teams. What is it that makes a team self-organizing or not? And when you're done with your thought, press return. All right, autonomy. I like that. Treat people like equals. I like that a lot. Choice of ownership. Those doing the work decide how and sometimes the what. Collaborative decisions. Belief. Catch you later, Ron. David G has to leave. Participation of all members. Fearless. Working together. Geet sent me by a direct message the word accountability. All right, so let me describe what I think is essential to self-organizing teams, which is that everyone has to participate. Every team member must step up for a team to be self-organizing. And in part, it's because everyone has unique expertise. So our product manager brings that skill of talking to customers and stakeholders and bringing what it is that they're looking for. Our front-end developer brings skill at front-end development. Our database developer with the database, our back-end developer, our manual tester, our automated tester, our testing tools person, our dev tools folks, each of us brings unique expertise. And that means that everyone leads from their expertise when it's most needed, which means that everyone on a self-organizing team is a leader. It's only one leader at a time, but leadership in a self-organizing team passes back and forth among the members of the team transparently. Even the intern out of college as a leader from time to time. Everyone is a leader. So go back to metaphor again. If our self-organizing team, so this is a question to all of you. So whoever's got the answer, unmute and call it out. If our self-organizing team were an acting troupe, what kind of acting do we do? Everyone's a leader.
Improv.
Improv. Thank you. Why?
Because they're feeding off of what the other person's saying. They're listening and they're feeding off, and they're playing off.
Yeah, that's great. There's a rule of thumb in improv that everyone. So I gave myself an improv class a few years ago, a one-day improv class, and I have since discovered that the rule of thumb I learned there is the rule of thumb that every single person who takes an improv class learns. Who can tell me what it's only 3 or 4 words? No, it's only 2 words.
Yes, and.
Thank you. Yes, and so we're always saying yes. We're always listening for where the troop is taking it, and we're looking at, and do I have something that I can add onto that? And furthermore, and I love the definition you just gave a minute ago, because we keep listening while we're contributing our and, because somebody else is going to and it may be before we thought we were going to be done. So If our self-organizing team or a music group, what kind of music do we perform?
Is that jazz?
Jazz more often than not. Freeform jazz, in many, if not most, freeform jazz groups, every single member of the group solos. And soloing does not mean playing by themselves. It means they're leading. And they listen for when it's their turn to lead. And they take off from there and let the group follow, and they listen for when somebody else takes the lead. There's this constant listening going on inside of self-organizing teams. So who's the leader in improv? Who's the leader in jazz? Everyone is. Only one at a time. We pass it back and forth, and when our expertise calls for us to contribute, we contribute. So when we look at Agile values and we look at best team characteristics, there's a match. Shared leadership, self-organizing teams, trust, mutual respect, psychological safety. They're indelibly linked. So many of you by now, so 6 years ago that Google did this, know about Google's Project Aristotle, but inevitably there's somebody who doesn't. So I'm going to share a little bit of what happened here. So Google, just like the rest of us, have high-performing teams and low-performing teams and teams that are in between. Google, unlike the rest of us, has a ton of money. And they spend it. And they thought, somebody at Google said, well, let's find out why some of our teams, why all of our teams aren't high-performing. What constitutes a high-performing team? What makes our high-performing teams high-performing? And when they launched the Aristotle team to do the Aristotle study of all of their teams, and they went into it believing that it was going to be team makeup, that it was going to be, oh, there's a 10x programmer, one of those 10 times as productive programmers on the high performance teams, or maybe everybody on the team is a 10x programmer, or maybe it's diversity, or maybe it's lack of diversity, or maybe it's age, or maybe it's lack of age, or maybe, but it had to do with it, but it turned out it did not have to do with team makeup. There were all kinds of team makeups in their high performance teams. What they found in common, they described with 2 words that up until then, I had not heard used in the context of software development, and since then have become pretty common in software development. I just used them a minute ago, and those 2 words are psychological safety. Google's highest performing teams had psychological safety. Psychological safety is generally described as the opportunity and the safety for every single member of the team to speak up. And that mutual respect, there's that respect word there again, encourages everyone to be a leader, even the intern, to speak up and share what they, if the intern hasn't learned something in college that the rest of us don't know, we probably hired the wrong intern. They should be able to lead too. And Google said, and we can see psychological safety on those teams, because in those teams there is equality in the distribution of conversational turn taking. There is no one who dominates the conversation on those teams. There is no one who is silent on those teams. There is relative equality in the amount of time each member of the team talks in any particular discussion on that team. Now, I told you I've been involved with Agile since 1999. I've been training teams in Agile for almost a decade and a half. And a decade and a half ago, when I started training teams, I got this question fairly often: are there projects that are not suitable for Agile? Agile was just eking its way into software development a decade and a half ago. It had been around for a decade and a half already, but it wasn't widely used. And so teams were wondering, well, is this appropriate for us? And is there kinds of software that's not appropriate for? And I did a lot of scratching in my head and trying to figure out the answer to that. And I kind of came up with, well, maybe, but no, not really. And then it suddenly occurred to me, and it took me a couple of years to suddenly occur to me, but it suddenly occurred to me that it's the wrong question. That if we ask instead, are there projects not suitable for Agile? Are there cultures not suitable for Agile? Then the answer is easy. Because micromanaged cultures are not suitable for Agile. Micromanagement disrupts Agile. It prevents best teams. It prevents learning. I'm sure most of you have had experience with micromanaged teams where they just become order takers. Just stick their hands in their pockets and say, okay, what do you want next? Just tell me what to do. Where Agile calls for, and the point of my number one point of these 5 points, that Agile calls for everyone on the team to step up. It calls for us to be self-organized teams. Micromanagement causes everyone to step back. Now, one of the challenges for those of us who are managers, we've got teams that have shared leadership. Everybody on the team is a leader. So what's the role of a manager? And I'm going to use the word manager. I'm going to use it both of people managers, but also loosely to include product managers and project managers and program managers and scrum masters who don't have the word manager in their title, but and tech leads who have the word lead instead of manager in their title. But the problem is traditionally, we who became managers, we became leads or scrum masters, we like to run things. We like to give direction. I like to tell people what to do. Here I am talking to all of you. I like being the center of attention. And the problem for us, problem for people managers specifically, is that when our trainers, and here's a Scrum trainer who brings in a picture of here's what the Scrum team looks like and here's who they deal with, and there's not a manager in that picture. What's the manager's role? And if we dig into it, we find out that whether you're a product manager, a project manager, a people manager, a Scrum master, we're all servant leaders. That's our role. And I love this characterization that Marilson Campos, then a VP of engineering, shared to say, if you're the Scrum master and everyone's looking at you, you're doing it wrong. I shared this with a team that I was consulting with in Philadelphia a half dozen years ago. I shared it with all the Scrum masters. One of them stepped up, and she was a short in stature woman who said, oh yeah, she said, I looked for the tallest guy in the room in a stand-up and I stand behind him and see if anybody noticed. I thought, oh, you got it, yes. They're not looking at you, they're talking to each other. So roles of people managers, and to some extent the other groups of managers, that broader category of managers I was giving, we all, in fact, we hope that our teams are all doing this as well, fostering an Agile culture. But we in management roles have more opportunity with the rest of the organization and more broadly to foster an Agile culture, to model and defend and evangelize Agile values, to empower self-organization and excellence and psychological safety. And I made this a fourth bullet, a separate one, because all of you who've ever done Scrum know what the answer to who removes impediments, and it's not managers. It's Scrum masters. Scrum masters remove impediments. Everybody who's ever worked with Scrum knows that Scrum masters remove impediments. But who do Scrum masters escalate to when they're out of their depth, when they need to push something higher? Managers. Managers have always had the role of removing impediments as well. And then managers have typical roles like counseling and coaching and mentoring. scaling the organization, scaling Scrum or scaling whatever agile practice we're using, and hiring and firing. Frankly, the teams do now, but I have seen very few teams that want to be in charge of figuring out all of the logistics of hiring, let alone dealing with their worst members, their non-contributory, or the no assholes rule, the jerks on their teams. They want to escalate to managers and have managers deal with that. So to continue on that topic, I'll point you to my book and to 2 chapters we wrote specifically about these topics. One about establishing a successful programming culture, an entire chapter on that, which is fundamentally this kind of culture. And secondly, if you're agile, what do managers do? An entire chapter on dealing with that. So I'm going to stop there before we go to the other 4. I'm going to stop there and ask, so questions, let's take questions about not just doing agile, but being agile. Questions, comments, insights, objections, fierce disagreement.
I have one question around, you're in a large organization, maybe it's not a software only company, and I've been in biotech now for a decade. So I definitely see this a lot, where the culture at an executive level or in other groups like chemistry and biology, things like that, is not servant leadership oriented. It's very, very results oriented management. Is there a solution in those kinds of industries or places, or? So we talk about this a bunch in that culture chapter that I just pointed you to, but the, I think as software development leaders, one, we need to look to what is the organizational culture, and organizational culture usually includes a bunch of values, value statements. Dave, I don't know whether you still got your card from Apple, but I think I've got mine somewhere that lists the mission on one side and the values on the other. And I come into very few large companies that haven't done that. And the values, whether they're honored or not, those values are ones that we can leverage. Sometimes they get in the way, even though they may be good values. So I'll go to Schwab, where I spent 7 years. Charles Schwab has a value of teamwork. It also has a value of relentlessly delivering value to customers. That's not stated the way it is in the values, but it's basically that. And that latter one can lead individuals on teams to put blinders on. Well, I'm just going to focus on my work, and I'm going to get my work done, and I'm going to get that delivered, and I'm not going to share what I learned with anybody else, and I'm not going to learn from anybody else because I haven't got time to. I've got to focus on, and we as software development leaders have to nurture a culture of teamwork and sharing and mutual learning and teamwork and all of those values, and it's not easy, but I think it's incumbent upon us to do that. Dave, did that help? Yeah, no, that's helpful. Like, I hadn't thought to use the company values like that as a leverage. I think the real answer for me personally is I need to get out of biotech. Certainly, one of the values that I think we want to have in software development, whether we're agile or not, is delivering value to customers, impacting the universe. Our mission at Apple was we're going to change the world, and by God, we did. That was a powerful mission statement, a powerful motivating statement, a powerful North Star. And I think you've got one of those actually, Dave, in your biotech company.
At least one.
Oh, no, for sure. Yeah, we're definitely impacting human health in positive ways. But I have noticed these companies are, they're doing PACE PLC, waterfall, and they're proud of it. This is an improvement.
Yeah. Other comments, insights, objections before we move on? All right, this is a quiet group. Okay. So let's jump into the second one then. All I have to do is find it now. There it is. So let's jump into the second one, which is definitions of done. Now, I mentioned I've been training teams in Agile for almost 15 years. I counted them up last year. And surprised myself that I've done 171 Agile trainings over that course or that period of time. It was more than twice what I thought. But somewhere along the line, through that process, and I think it was about 6 years ago, it began to occur to me the power of the definition of done, of a team-wide, the team together defining what done means. And I don't mean acceptance criteria. And I'll get clearer on that in a few minutes, but I mean a definition of done that we can apply to every single story. The same definition of done, every story. Are we done or not? It's not. Well, it works on my machine, I must be done. I've heard that one. It's not. It compiles, I'm done. No. Let's together figure out what done means. And so 6 years ago, when so I don't think I mentioned I'm also the co-author of the study of product team performance, and we survey, over the last decade, we've done 7 of these, I think, where we've surveyed thousands of members of product teams all over the world to ask them, one, do you consider your team to be high performance or low performance or something in between? And then ask them about various practices. And it occurred to me we could ask them about definitions of done. And really what I was looking for was, does having a definition of done matter? But then it occurred to me, well, I've been in companies where management hands down definitions of done. Does it also matter who creates the definition of done? So that was the question we asked. In the 2016 study. Okay, so that's 7 years ago. And here's the answer we got. I'm convinced that there was confusion between acceptance criteria and definitions of done. But here we've got everything from no one did to management told us to the team itself created it to engineering management or product management handed it down. One of the elements of the study is we have a member of our team, of our co-authoring team, who is a data scientist and looks into the data to see, are there correlations between practices and the high performance or the low performance teams? And what he found in this case was that in fact, there is a correlation, that having a definition of done matters and who creates it matters. Those product teams that had no definition of done correlated with the teams that people called out as being the lowest performance teams. Product teams that had definitions of done that were handed down by managers outside the team correlated with just the average performers. The people who said, yeah, our team's not high performance, it's not low performance, it's just average. Those teams where the definition of done was created on the team correlated with the highest performance teams. The takeaway being that definitions of done matter, and that created within the team itself matters most. So definitions of done, again, I want to differentiate definitions of done from acceptance criteria, where acceptance criteria are unique for each story. So each story has its own acceptance criteria. The definition of done is something we apply to every story.
The definition of, and while acceptance criteria are customer criteria, what are they looking for out of this story? Definition of done is essentially engineering quality and completion. And it's a shared definition, as we were just looking at in the study. What the study revealed was that crafted by everyone on the team, developers and testers and product managers, correlates with the highest performance teams. Now, one more thing, which is I have never seen two definitions of done that were alike. Every team's definition of done is unique. It is worded in the words of the team. And that's really helpful. So what's the purpose of a common definition of done? Well, it's so that one developer doesn't say, I'm done, and compiles. That's among other things. There's a whole joke of how many developers does it take to change a light bulb? The light bulb works perfectly fine in my office. So alignment of all of our, not just of all of our developers of what it needs to be done, but of our developers and our testers and our product managers. This is what for our team, or the product that our team is working on, what the quality of every story should match the quality that we want to ship. It allows us to finish stories and move on with a fair amount of confidence. Now, we all know that integrating yet more stories can reveal bugs that we weren't able to find before, but fair amount of confidence. Now, another piece to this is the longer you wait before fixing bugs, the more expensive it gets. And back in my waterfall days, we did things like saying, oh, that bug, well, we'll fix that at the end. Here's an interesting chart I ran across, I think last year. The time before fixing is the left to right, and the cost to fix bugs is the vertical. And if you catch it very early on, you catch it the moment you wrote it. Oh, I just made a typo. I can fix the typo. If it's a day or two later, well, it's probably, that bug is probably in that function. Let me go look at that function. I might actually be in the same code that I just checked out, that I had checked out yesterday or the day before, or the day before that, but I might not. A week later, I'm looking at code that, and this is, I own this. My personal experience, code I wrote a week ago becomes cloudy very quickly. I'm wondering, how does this work again? And then 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks later, you look at code that you may have written and you think, I didn't write that. Nobody on my team wrote that. Previous team must have written that code. Doesn't look familiar at all. Just dramatically gets more expensive. So we want every story done to the quality level of the product, so that when we're done with all the stories, we're done with the product. And it gives us predictability when we come up with a common definition of done before we start writing code. And it gives us predictability in estimating and delivery, because we're all talking about the same thing. So before we begin writing code, and in fact, before we do relative sizing, before we do estimating. All right, so comments, questions about definitions of done. Objections, wishes.
Trying to get the unmute found here. So can you give us some examples?
Can I give you some
From
examples?
the,
So do you want to look at an example?
yeah, how about some examples?
Okay. Give me just a second and let me bring up a few examples. Sorry, my chat window's in the way.
of definitions of done.
And while you're bringing up those examples, have you seen bad definitions of done, like things that maybe weren't allowing the team to work as well, even though they all agreed on it?
That's a good question, Giddy. The one thing that I see teams doing from time to time is being aspiring, writing aspirational definitions of done, as opposed to ones we can actually live with. I like the idea of aspiring to have better quality than we're currently capable of. I like the idea of aspiring to having a full regression test suite that covers every 100% of our code, which some teams occasionally will aspire to. But if we're not there, let's create a second list of what we aspire to, and here's the ones we're going to live with today. So let me jump down here and show you a few definitions of done. Only requires 18 extra clicks to begin sharing something. There we go. So I'm going to read this down. I think this is the very first definition of done I facilitated. This was 14 or 15 years ago. That's my hand and my handwriting. And unfortunately, I was using an orange marker. So the definition of done was it's complete. The story is complete. We can demo it. It's been approved by the product owner. It's been tested and works as planned. Now, this is another one that we can fall into. Sometimes a team will say it satisfies the intention at a point at which they deliver what the story said, what the story's requirements, what the story asked for, what the acceptance criteria called for, and then the product owner comes back and said, well, yeah, but that's not what the customer wants. The customer wants, and in my mind, those are all additional stories. Have we finished this story? Yes, we finished this story. Now, that's in my mind. And so what the team wants, and this team said, it's tested and it works as planned. So that's what they want. They want to be sure that there's documentation and specifications. They have test cases. They have release notes. The QA has tested it and provided a QA report on it. And they've updated their velocity on their burnout chart. Now here's another team. The code's been checked into master. They're 99% of the time these days, that's not a problem. But I have been at companies that code was not checked into master and it disappeared when a developer left or a hard drive crashed or the cloud did something terrible, or and they felt like we better name that. So code checked into master, it compiles error-free, static analysis passes, conforms to our coding standard, passes automated unit tests. Design is obviously not in order because your design was done and there was a design review done before we started coding it. Doxygen was one of their test tools. Unit tests were coded and passed and integrated into the continuous integration. The code was reviewed by someone other than the person who wrote it, and the internal customer agrees that the requirements were met. Here was a team that said, I think our definition of done for the whole project is going to be different than our definition of done for every story. And I said, okay, so let's list what's required for every story, and we'll create a second column for the project. And we listed that whole list there on the left, and the team said, well, for the project, the only additional thing is that there's user buy-in that the project's done. Okay. Again, everything in their words. Here's a team that was they had a very successful product. That was making them tons and tons of money.
but they were trying to come up with second and third and fourth projects and products, and they were basically creating MVPs and throwing them up against the wall to see if they'd stick. And so the left-hand side is for experiments, the right-hand side was for production. For those of you who have coded, or maybe been a product manager who's had a team that's coded an experiment or a prototype or a proof of concept, you know that it's band-aided together, and you do not want to put that into production and put a ton of people accessing it. You want very different criteria when it's in production than your initial experiment. And that's what this team wanted. They wanted a definition of done for their experiments, and a definition of done for production. And then there's a couple of things you might want to consider that I picked up from Intuit. A couple of acronyms, WASDO and WCATSDO. We often screw this up, and we can't afford to screw this up. And those two are very useful for reminding ourselves that maybe if we often screw this up, maybe we ought to have a bullet on our definition of done. And maybe if we can't afford to screw this up, maybe we ought to have a bullet on our definition of done. So this is, you might want to take a screenshot of this. I'll leave this here for 10 seconds. So you can take a screenshot of it. You might want to take a screenshot of it. This is just categories of things that your team might want to think about as they're creating their definition of done. I think a good definition of done is probably 7 or 8 or 9 bullets at most. There was one of those definitely had half again more than that. So it's I don't limit them, but it's very useful to think through what it is that we can hold ourselves, what it is we're willing to hold ourselves to, so that we don't have to come back and revisit this stuff. So when we say we're done with a story, we're actually done with a story. All right, other questions around definitions of done? Or comments? All right, let's jump into the third one. Stand-ups. So we studied this one in the study of product team performance the year or two before that, 2015. We asked how effective and how frequent are stand-ups in your organization. And these were our results. And I'll walk them through based on the correlations, because sometimes when we asked about practices, there's no correlation between that practice and high performance or low performance teams, but there is with stand-ups. And what we found is that product teams that do not hold stand-ups or hold ineffective stand-ups perform the worst, correlate with the teams that are lowest performance. Product teams with stand-ups that are effective and regular perform better than average. And the ones with effective and daily stand-ups perform the best. So our takeaways being stand-ups matter, and stand-ups held daily and effectively matter most. That does lead to the question of what makes for effective stand-ups. And I suspect that people who said that we have effective stand-ups don't match this, but there are some nuances to stand-ups that I want you to consider. So one word, almost everybody who does stand-ups at some time or other has used the 3 questions, and more often than not, it uses them now. The third question, first 2 questions I'm going to come back to. The third question is, what's standing in my way? Do I have an impediment? Is something blocking me? I hear multiple different ways of asking that question, and all of them I find fine. I think it's a really valuable question, a really valuable thing for everyone on the team to be sharing during a stand-up. The first two questions, so think about what the first 2 questions have been in your organization or organizations you've been involved with. 95% of the time, I see them stated as what I did and what am I going to do. What did I do yesterday? What did I do in the last 24 hours? What did I do, and what am I going to do in the next 24 hours, the next day, by tomorrow, by the next stand-up, something along those lines.
And I'm going to suggest to you that that wording is broken. And what we're really looking for is, what did I accomplish against our sprint goal in the last 24 hours? And what am I going to accomplish of our sprint goal by tomorrow, by our next stand up? Because when it's what we do, it's, I went to a bunch of meetings yesterday. Okay, well, that sounds like impediments to me. Doesn't sound like contributing to the sprint goal. What am I going to do? So one of the things is that if we are truly sharing what we accomplished relative to the sprint goal, we're sharing whether we're on track or not, or whether our part of what the team's doing is on track. And then those 3 questions are useful, but they're not enough because they're all me focused, not team focused. So remember, software development's a team sport. And there's this tendency, if we're just answering the 3 questions, we can send those back and forth by Slack. We don't have to stand up at all. Well, my contention is that if software development's a team sport, we ought to talk to each other at least once a day. If you watch, this is football season, if you watch football, they have a stand-up every play. That's a team sport. They have a stand-up every play. Both teams, the defense and the offense. We don't want to be a bunch of individuals reporting to the same stand-up. We want to be a team. And we want our focus to be, how are we doing on our sprint plan? We planned if we're doing Scrum, we plan the next 2 weeks, or a week, or 3 weeks, or however long our sprints are. And it led me and I learned this from one of my colleagues, but it led me to introduce the Fist of 5 technique to bring the focus from me to us, where the question is, are we on track to make our sprint plan? So Fist of 5, for those of you who've never used Fist of 5 is on a signal. We ask a question on a signal, everybody holds up their answer, and the answer is in one hand. A fist, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 fingers. So if the question is, are we on track to make our sprint plan? No fingers is no confidence. There's no way in hell we're going to make our sprint plan. I don't think we've got a shot at it. I am totally confident that we can make our sprint plan still. We are on track. We're doing this. And of course, everything in between. And what I'm looking for at what we think is the end of the stand-up, what I'm looking for is 4s and 5s. I'm totally confident. I'm pretty darn confident that we're on track for our sprint plan. That's a good signal. That's a good signal. If everybody on the team is giving 4s and 5s, we're probably pretty on track. If it's not, then we're not done with the stand-up, because we've got one more question, which is, how can we work together as a self-organizing team to accomplish our sprint goal? Somebody may have heard me say, boy, I walked in, I thought it was going to take me 2 days to work on this thing. And what I accomplished yesterday was finding out that it's probably going to take me a week and a half to accomplish this thing. There's a ton of technical debt in there, in that part of the code. And the algorithm I thought I could use is going to work there. And my colleagues are, and so, if I'm not voting a 2 or a fist or something at that point, my colleague should be, my teammate should be. So Sally says, oh, Ron, I've been in that code. I know that technical debt, and I know the algorithm that you could use to do this. Let me help you out. Or if you take my stuff and I take yours, I think I know how to do that, and I can take it. And I think I can get it finished in the amount of time you thought. And I think you can do the thing that I have on my plate. Now we're working as a team to figure out how to get our sprint goal back on track. Now, if everybody ran into technical debt and nobody can help me out, because everybody is either dead on, they've got no extra time for what they had planned for the sprint, then we've got an early heads up to our product owner that we've got too much stuff in our sprint. we took on a sprint plan that's too big. And we didn't know that. We thought it was right, but guess what? Ron just ran into a ton of technical debt. It's going to take him a week and a half instead of 2 days for one piece. And that means he's not going to finish everything and nobody can help him out. And we need to take something out. And it might be the thing Ron's working on, or it might be the thing Ron's working on is the most important thing. That's what our product owner is in the stand-up for, is to advise us which thing we can most afford to remove from our sprint plan. And then we can gang up on the rest of it and get the rest of our sprint plan done. We can deliver the most value we can deliver to our customer and our business at the end of the sprint. Our product person, our product owner, our product manager is a person best in the swim, talking to the stakeholders, talking to customers, all of that, to know which thing that we can most easily pull. And introducing that simple fist to five practice can really help a group of individuals become a team. So comments on stand-ups? Are your stand-ups effective? Are your stand-ups done via Slack?
Hey, Ron, wanted to comment a little bit about the, doing stand-ups over Slack or whatever. Distributed teams, which I've worked on, sometimes that's how we have to do it, especially when we're in different time zones.
When you're distributed by time zone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I also did a kind of a side hustle, 3-man team. We all had day jobs working on a little product. We ended up doing a stand-up in, actually, I think it was Slack, where we did the 3 questions. Tried to get to it daily. What'd you work on, blah, 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 what do you need, etc. And I know you kind of counsel against the 3 questions here, but it was still very effective.
Yeah,
each team member.
I want to clarify, I'm not counseling against the 3 questions, only that they're not enough.
Yeah, okay. But the fact that we actually went ahead.
Yeah, I think they're very useful. I think they provided some really good information on where each of us individually is at.
Exactly.
Now we get our team back on track if anyone isn't able to if I run into that week-long technical debt slog that I thought I'd be through in a day, is there help for that?
Right. But as long as we were doing that regular communication, the project moved forward.
Yes, regular communication is absolutely critical.
And
daily. Oh, sorry.
yeah, I was going to suggest too, out there in the lean world, we do huddles and huddle boards, and we do it in the beginning of the day and the end of the day. And so if you're on manufacturing and you're producing medicine, and it's very important and critical that certain things get done, we do A3s and other things to help make sure that we overcome our challenges, right? So this whole concept of having these conversations and determining what to do, even in the lean world or the scrum world or whatever, is a critical concept.
For those of you who don't know, Jay works at Lilly pharmaceutical company. I like it. But somebody else was trying to jump in a minute ago.
Yeah, I wanted to say that the practice of daily is one of the first things to do to get in touch or feel about these ideas about agility. And so I just wanted to say that if somebody asks, so what would be something we can practice? So daily, my answer is always like something like daily, so we can rapidly know about how is the team and make something about it, right?
Yeah, it does seem like if it's a team sport, we ought to talk to each other at least once a day. All right, thanks, Dennis. Any other comments before we move on to planning?
I believe Alex had a question prior to your last comment. I posted it or shared it with you.
Sorry, I'm not seeing it. Can you read it?
I'm sure.
How do we
Follow-up
avoid-
question when you
Yeah,
follow-up question when you get a chance. How do we avoid scope creep and does late discovery of additional stories change the definition of done?
so definition of, so it could. It's possible that our stories lead us into an area of coding or of project or product that redefined our definition of done. And a definition of done is not should be agile. Right? We should be able to retrospect on it. We should be able to ask ourselves the question, and this is actually a good answer to that earlier question of do I see definitions of done that don't work? If they're aspirational, or if they're in some way there's something that we can't meet, or in some way there's something that we should be meeting that we're not, we can identify that as one of the things that we might want to try and experiment on coming out of our retrospective. And my goal of coming out of retrospectives is that there's always one experiment to try. That we're not committing to do this forever. We're just going to try it as an experiment. But we're going to try an experiment where we're going to add this bullet to our definition of done, or we're going to take this bullet, or we're going to change this bullet in our definition of done, or we're going to try meeting together at the end of the day and the beginning of the day, as Jay's doing at Lilly. Or, we're going to try something that might make us happier, might make us more effective, might increase the quality of our product, might make us more productive, might bring us closer to that ideal team, that best team that we've ever been on. And we can certainly do that with definitions of done. Now, the question of scope creep, my objective in Scrum with sprint plans is we create a sprint plan, we work the sprint plan, we don't do scope creep. If there's scope creep, it goes on the backlog, with the exception that if prod goes down, we're going to work on that. There is no team that I have yet met that when prod goes down, we don't go try, we don't, it's not everybody's on board to figure out why prod's down and get it back up again. Pretty critical. But short of those kinds of that character of things, we should be putting things in the backlog. And then it's up to our product manager or product owner to determine where on the backlog it goes. Does it go at the top of the backlog? Or is there something on the top of the backlog that for the next sprint, in fact, that we ought to work on before we do that scope creep?
Yeah, and I would say, Ron, depending on what you're working on, you have to plan the possibility that you'll have a spike. So scope creep can happen outside or inside the team. So if I'm working on a Gen AI product and I do my vector analysis on LLM content, I can find there's a lot of additional work that I didn't plan for, and I'm going to have to spike it, right? And that is internally the team has created scope creep, right? Because we peeled back the onion, we did the experiment like you kept talking about, and we found out that, hey, crap, this is going to take a lot more than we thought to do this, right? So scope creep can come internally as well as externally from the team.
Yeah, internally, the example I gave of running into technical debt is exactly that kind of. It's not scope that's changed, it's the implementation challenge that's changed. And our stand-up is an opportunity to identify whether we're on track for our sprint plan or not, and whether we can adapt, whether we can adjust, whether we can be agile, whether we've given ourselves room to do that, whether somebody else is so good at what they thought, so much better at what they thought that they can help me out with my problem, with the additional LLMs that Jay needs to work on, or whether we need to pull something out. And as I said before, I think a product owner is the person the contributor to the team most tuned into what it is that we can most readily pull out with the least impact. All right, let's jump into planning. And so if you're doing Kanban, you're probably not building a sprint plan. Kanban doesn't have sprint plans, but if you're doing Scrum, you're doing sprint plans. In sprint planning meetings, the fundamental #1 rule is that backlog reordering has to be complete walking into sprint planning. Product managers don't get to start changing up the backlog reordering during sprint planning. It needs to be ordered by what's going to deliver the most value to our customers. And given a backlog that is correctly ordered, that's ordered and ready for the team to come in and plan their sprint, now what happens is the team comes in and starts pulling cards from the backlog into the plan. They're not assigned by anybody. They're not assigned by the Scrum Master. They're not assigned by the product owner. This is a self-organizing team. And 95%, 99% of the time, they're going to pull the top story on the backlog into the sprint plan. Now, my rule of thumb is that 2.5, the top of the backlog has to be 2.5 stories, 2.5 sprints deep with stories that are ready to be pulled into a sprint. It has to be at least that deep because the team the 1% of the time the reason the team doesn't pull the top story into the sprint plan is because when they were doing sizing at the beginning of the project or the product, and they looked at that story, and we discovered that Sally, who had just joined our team, had written that routine at previous companies 5 times, and she could write it in her sleep. And we discovered that Bob understands where the technical debt is, where that code is going to go, and it's scary. There are dragons in that part of the code, and Bob and Sally are both on PTO this sprint. That's the one reason I can think of, and maybe another reason, but that's the one I can think of. Over the course of the last decade, that's the one I have been able to think of that we would not pull that top story into the sprint plan. Now, our product owner may say, we got to do that anyway. We got to do that without Sally and Bob. It's like, okay, we're going to get less done. We're going to have to apply more people to it. We're going to have a less effective sprint plan. It's this toss-up between what's the most effective thing we can do and what do we have to do in order to satisfy stakeholders and customers this sprint. And we're doing that, but the team is pulling things into the sprint based on what's going to be most effective. But doing that, we can lose sight of being a team. And as we break stories into tasks and identify who's going to tackle which task for how long, that can become much less team oriented, much more, well, this is my part. I'll just get my part done. And our goal is a perfect sprint plan for our team that optimizes our team's effectiveness. It optimizes value delivery. And here again, a fist of 5 can be really useful. A fist of 5 confidence vote. Do we have the best sprint plan? And where a fist means I think it's a terrible sprint plan. I think we could put a ton more in, or I think we've way overloaded it. A 5 is, I think this is a perfect sprint plan for our team. Best sprint plan we could have come up with. And again, I'm looking for 4s and 5s on the sprint plan. And very quickly, do we have a sprint plan yet? Oh, I don't know. Let's do a fist of 5. Very quickly, we find out. We get 4s and 5s. We got a sprint plan. We're done. We don't have to have a lot more conversation about whether we're there or not when we do that. So again, conversation around fist of 5, same technique as we were going to use in stand-ups. Fist of 5 to find out whether to come together as a team, do we have our best sprint plan? And have everyone's
This is
contribution.
Rao.
Yeah, go ahead.
I know you are mentioning the fist of 5 at the end of the sprint planning, but do you expecting the team to plan at the level of tasking, or how can the capacity wise and how much they taken, and is going to be distributed by the team members? So everybody should be knowing who is doing what, and then only they can say we are all comfortable, correct? So are we expecting at this point they should we go by the tasking level or high over level, or just give overall I am okay like that?
So what I find is that when we do fist of 5, we find out whether there's comfort with the sprint plan. And it guides the technique. So you're asking me about the specific technique, and I advise teams that I have found it to be useful to fully break down stories into tasks and know who's going to work on each task. And in fact, you can write your name on those tasks and say, you know, I think if I do this one and this one and this one and this one, that my plate's full. And if I try to do more than that, I'm going to be in trouble. And I think that's very useful in the planning meeting. But teams will very quickly find out whether that's working for them or not. And they can retrospect then on that in the retrospective and say, let's do it slightly differently. Let's try it. Let's try doing this instead. So Rao, I do in training talk about story refinement ahead of time, coming into the planning meeting for anything that's got complexity to it, so that the people who might be working on it don't subject the rest of the team to having to go through what oftentimes is a very long discussion about how to break it down and what algorithm to use and what tech debt's in that area, and certainly what you want to know going in, and doing story refinement ahead of the planning meeting is very useful for that. And for anything that's not complex, we can do it very quickly. If we can do it in 5 minutes in the planning meeting, that seems fine to me. So anything that's not complex, we're going to do that same breakdown, but we're going to do it during the planning meeting and say, okay, so this task is mine. I'm going to take the front end piece. Sue, you take the data. You're going to take the database piece. Yep, I got it. How about that back end piece? Okay. So I think it's very helpful, Ralph.
One thing that I've done in recent years is get in the habit after sprint planning of letting the team figure out all that stuff on their own. And then the first stand up that I have, like the next day, day 1, 9 o'clock in the morning, the sprint is just starting. Instead of asking the typical questions, because we just started the sprint, I'll say, okay, everyone just say, what's your starting point? What's your plan? We're starting today. Here's my plan. And people got in the habit of being ready for that question. And I'm going to work on this today. I took this story. I'm going to do these tasks. And it showed that they were able to go away and figure out that stuff on their own. And then come either as a team or individuals, and then come back to the team and say, here's where we're starting.
Mm-hmm. So the 3 of us are going to work on this story, and we each know where we're going to start on in order to get started on that story. Yeah, I think one of the things that I didn't that we're not talking about, which is the during the sprint part, we're talking about planning, but during the sprint part is that there's sometimes I see one of the anti-patterns I see is that it's like, okay, I'm done with my part. Like, yeah, okay, but the story's not done. The value lies in the story. The value doesn't lie in the individual tasks. And we need to keep that focus on stories.
Interesting that it sounds like you typically can have a story where multiple people are assigned to it. And my experience in how we do things where I work is a story gets assigned to a person. So if there's multiple people that have to be involved in something, we would typically break it into multiple stories and hand the stories to each person.
So my personal experience is that there are, so I've had one client that I said, okay, so you've got full stack engineers, but probably your full stack engineers, one of them has a depth, they're T-shaped people, right? One of them has depth in front end, and one of them has depth in databases, and one of them has depth in back end, and one of them has depth in delivery, and they're wide, and I had one client who said, no, they're deep in everything, and I pushed back against that and pushed back against that and pushed back against that and said, okay, they're deep in everything. You can do that. But for everybody else, they're T-shaped people. And having a person who's got depth in front end, or who's got depth with that part of the code, or who's got depth with databases. I know personally, I'm much more of a front end, back end person than a database person. And boy, I want to partner with somebody who's good at databases when I'm working on that, on a story that involves both front end and database work, or front end and back end and database work. I'm willing to take the front end and the back end, although in today's enterprise areas, I'm probably not going to be fully familiar with both of those. So I'm probably going to take one of those and partner with somebody who's got the other part, and absolutely partner with somebody in the database area. So that's what I find is most effective. And why?
Okay, interesting. I think we would perhaps seek out assistance, and maybe when you say partner, like I might consult with somebody, but if it's my story, it's my story. I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm trying to understand your experience. And it's interesting that I hear you say that a story can belong to multiple people, because I've never seen that.
I find more often than not that I find sometimes that teams own all the tasks. More often than not, I find that individuals, a front end person owns the front end task of that story, and we've broken it down into 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 pieces, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 tasks that we've got people who are really good at those things, and they're partnering together as a sub team to get that story done.
And this brings up an interesting conversation we'll discuss in December, is how do you create teams that are full feature teams that go down the tech stack that can get the work done. So for example, if I'm working in AWS and cloud, and I'm doing down the tech stack, when I have a team, we have people on the team that can have multiple skills. So the skill mapping is very important, right? Whether it's NoSQL type of access to distributed data or relational databases, or Java person, C++ person, or a data scientist, right? So when we compose a team, the team has to be composed to a point to where we have everybody on the team that can get the work done for that container. So anyone that's familiar with C4 model or design-driven development and so forth, that's the concepts we're moving into now in architecture, and how we architect our solutions, especially now in the future with Gen AI and everything. It's about the team composition and about the skills on the team, like what Ron has indicated. The future has a lot of interesting variables and interesting options that we have to take. And none of this is easy. It really depends upon the context of your organization, your technical stack, your technical architecture, and how you do your C1, C2, C3, and C4 models. And that determines how you should make up your team. And we'll have that discussion in December. But there's a lot of variances and variables in those discussions. There's no one size fits all.
And if Giddy, what's working for you is working for you, go for it. It's what retrospectives are for, is to find out the parts that aren't working and work on those. So all power to you. All right, let's jump into the last section. Estimating. So interestingly enough, in those discussion groups about Agile, boy, I see a lot of people saying, well, we shouldn't be asked for estimates. We're just going to finish what we get done. And that's not how the rest of the business works. Sales needs to know stuff they're going to be selling. Marketing needs to be planning for the marketing that they're going to be doing. Sales needs to be planning the sales pitches they're going to do. All the CFO needs to figure out revenue schemes and what it costs and when they're going to get revenue. We need to do some kind of estimating. The number one problem I see in Agile is that it revolves around pointing, and there's a whole bunch of people who say, well, we're not going to do pointing, and we're not going to do estimating at all. And how their business is put up with that, I don't know. But there's very few businesses that don't need some kind of leading indicator on when they're going to get stuff. The second or equally problematic for me is that pointing is fundamentally intended to be about relative sizing, not absolute sizing. And there are a couple of books that I found really interesting. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Blink, which is and actually Kahneman was the lead author on a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and they both talk about the fact that we've got two brains in our head. Actually, I think they talk about there being multiple brains in our head, but we've got two that apply in this case. One is absolute, one is detail oriented, one is analytical, and the other one is relative. And our analytical brain, we can spend just a ton of time getting down to the finest points. And in fact, that was what we did back in my waterfall days, where we drugged teams into dark rooms for days at a time in order to do work task breakdowns into the smallest, every smallest thing that we might have to do to build this product. And we put days and hours against those, and we fed that into some Microsoft product, either Excel or Microsoft project, which added them all up. And we walked out of the room dragging our heels, actually. I was going to say glowing, but no, we were dragging our heels. We were so tired at that point with a project scheme that was wrong. It was always wrong. And it was always wrong because absolute sizing is problematic. Relative sizing, on the other hand, is blink of an eye, and it's where Malcolm Gladwell's book title came from. The blink of an eye, his book title is Blink. The blink of an eye, you can see some things. So if we all stand on the Berkeley Hills have one thing that San Francisco doesn't have, which is a view of San Francisco. And if we stand on the Berkeley Hills and we look across at San Francisco and we look at the tallest building, if I point to the two tallest buildings in San Francisco and ask you how tall are those, I'm going to engage your absolute brain, your analytical brain. Your analytical brain, you might count all the window. If I have you talk out loud, you might count it. It's like a Google interview question. How many tennis balls can you fit into a 747?
And they want you to talk out loud. You talk out loud for the how tall are those two buildings? You may count the windows. You may come up with how tall each story is. It's like geez, there's the needle at the top. It doesn't have stories. Gee, it's a glass building, and I can't tell where the stories are. Oh, by the way, they didn't build those two tallest buildings on the Bayshore. There are buildings in the way. And their stories are different heights, and we've got to count the windows on those, and some of those don't have windows, and they first floor, and you spend a ton of time doing that. If, on the other hand, I ask you, point to the two tallest buildings, which one of those is tallest? You will, blink of an eye, tell me which one is taller. And if I then say, and so I've engaged your relative brain now, and if I then say, so how much taller, roughly? How much taller is it? What percentage? You'll probably stay in your relative brain and give me a 5% or 10%, or with the Salesforce tower, maybe a 20%. I'm not sure what the percentage should be on that one. But if then I give you the height of one building with whatever your percentage is, all of you within a minute will give me the height of the other building. Some of you within seconds. Some of you do math that quickly in your heads that you'll give me that the height of the other building. And that's what we do with relatives. That was the idea of pointing, was we point everything, our entire backlog, not sprint by sprint, our entire backlog. We look at our backlog is a jumble. We don't know what order it's in yet. We've just got all this stuff we got to build for our project in the next 3 to 5 months. And we relatively size it all, and then that gives an indication to our product manager, to our product owner, of how to order it in the backlog, so that we don't put teleportation at the top of the backlog. So they're all stories. So they're all broken down. Now, talking about sizing the entire backlog, we actually asked this question in the most recent studies. Our most recent study was actually there was a more recent one during the pandemic, but the 2019 study, we asked, do individual contributors size all their stories or requirements in the backlog, or just those have been selected for the next iteration? And these were our results. So I'm going to start on the right. So almost 16% said estimating. What estimating? That was the group that said, oh, we're Agile, we don't need to estimate. Almost 18%, 17.9% said we only have an iteration or two of stories in our backlog. We can't, there's no backlog to size. 50% almost said we have a quarter or more of stories in our backlog, but we only size them iteration by iteration. And 17% said we size our entire backlog of stories up front. We have a quarter or more and we size them up front. And when we looked at, is there a correlation between the results of this story, this question, and high performance and low performance teams, we found that those teams that are sizing their entire backlog correlates to the highest performance teams. That's 17%. That only 17% of organizations that undertake that. Pointing is not done by the tech lead. It's not done by the product owner. It's not done by the manager. It's done by the entire team. Why? So I'm going to do a quick chat storm. Why do we want the entire team to do sizing on our backlog? Why is that important? So don't press return. Just type an answer into the chat. And when you're done with your thought, press return. the discussion during the sizing session is key. We learned from sizing. Boy, is that ever true, Doug? I thank you for that first answer coming up. It's an incredible side effect of sizing is the team's learning. The very first time I did a sizing exercise, a sizing practice with a team, I realized that in 3 hours, the entire team had gained an understanding of the entire project and walked out of the room with what every product manager always wanted when they handed off the 100 pages of requirements to the team. The team understood what they were going to build. Not in detail, but they had a broad picture of it. That was just incredible. So ownership and commitment, they're self-organizing, you get perspective from all the members. There are a ton more good answers to this question. And there are not enough contributors to it, but I'm going to move on. Pointing an entire backlog should take less than half a day. In fact, my ideal time frame for it is 3 hours. I've worked with a ton of teams doing this. I've had one team take more than half a day. I had one team take 5 hours. They kept falling into their analytical brains. I kept having to drag them out of their analytical brains over and over. We wanted to point. I also had one backlog that had 500 some stories in it, and I said, no, we're not going to do that. We are not going to do this. We want that is not 3 to 6 months worth of work, and it's not 50 to 150 stories in epics. You need to prioritize those. Once they did that, and we had 120 stories, then we did it. So 2 different techniques that teams have used. One is planning poker. And for those of you who haven't used planning poker, and there's inevitably somebody who hasn't, everybody has a Fibonacci set of cards, and this is the modified Fibonacci set. 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20, 40, and 100 represent huge, huger, and hugest, or epic, epicer, and epicest. And somebody reads the first story. We've got all the stories. Somebody reads the first story, and everybody picks a card out of their hand and holds it up high. And if everybody's holding up an 8, we write an 8 onto that story and move on to the next story. If, on the other hand, somebody's holding up a 3 and somebody's holding up a 13, we have a conversation about why do you think it's a 3 and why do you think it's a 13, and then we all vote again. The problem is the number of problems that I see with planning poker. For one, for the very first story, where do you start? These numbers are made up. They're out of the blue. There's no such thing as a 5 or a 3 or an 8 or a 1 or there's just no such thing. So where do you start? 2, there's too much guessing. There's not enough relative. There's too much of, I think this is a 5. As opposed to, I think this is like that story is a 5, therefore this story is a 5. 3, it takes a long time. I have, in asking this question to dozens of teams, the question of, can you do planning poker for this many stories in epics, 3 to 6 months worth, or 50 to 150 stories in epics, can you do planning poker in 3 hours? I have had one person say yes out of hundreds. It takes a long time. 2-pass relative sizing, or sometimes called snaking and sometimes called the Steve Bachman method, is faster, and it guarantees that stories are sized relative to each other. It looks like this. It starts with a stack of cards. This is what it looks like in the physical world when we're not a hybrid team, when we're a co-located team. Show you what it looks like for a hybrid team in a minute. This team started with a stack of cards. One person put the first card, read the first card, put it in the middle of the table, handed the deck to the set of cards to the next person, who read the second story and said, I think it's going to take less time or more time, and handed to the next person, who said, I think it's going to take more time or less time, or goes in between the 2 that are already on the table. And there's a little bit of getting consent for where you're going to put it. It's not just I think that and I'm going to put it there, but I'm going to get consent from my team as we go. And the result is that after 2 hours, we had this snake, and at the upper left-hand end of the snake is the story that the team believes will take the least amount of time. At the lower right-hand end of the snake is the epic that the team believes will take the most amount of time. And then in the third hour, they ended up putting numbers on, starting at the small end with ones and getting to somewhere that that's not a one anymore. It's got to be a two. It's twice as much time as most of the ones are. And now we get to threes and fives and eights and 13s and 20s and 40s and hundreds. They're sized by modified Fibonacci numbers. They're ordered from smallest to largest. And we can do this using Miro or Mural and doing the same thing, except that we're probably not going to snake it. We're probably going to go in rows. So upper left is the story this team believes is going to take the least amount of time, goes across and then goes down to the next row from left to right, from left to right, from left to right until the longest epic is down there on the lower right. Again, using Miro. Using cards as opposed to stickies in Mural, using cards as opposed to stickies in Miro, and they reorganize them by their Fibonacci numbers here. And weighting contributes to two very useful outcomes. Product owners can order backlogs based not just on value, but on bang for the buck. It keeps us from putting teleportation at the top of the backlog, even though it's my favorite story, even though I think it would deliver more value than any other story. It is, in fact, a massive epic. And when I divide by an infinite amount of time, which is, I think, probably about how much teleportation will take, it belongs by bang for the buck, it belongs to the bottom of the backlog, not the top. And secondly, once we see an entire backlog of stories moving through our system, 1 and 2 and ideally 3 sprints. With 3 sprints, we can average how many points we get done in 3 sprints, and we can then walk down the rest of the backlog and draw a watermark for where we believe we'll get to. So we do not have time tonight for an exercise. I'm sorry to say, we're almost out of time. So we're going to skip forward and skip through these and just point out that the product owner then reorders the stories by ROI as a backlog. That snake is not the order we're going to work on them in. We're not going to work on the smallest story first. We're going to work on the highest ROI story first, the highest bang for the buck story first. And we're going to use velocity to predictably forecast a watermark. Once we've got 2 or 3 sprints and we can average our velocity, we can then use the velocity in plus or minus 20% in my experience, when we've relatively sized stories in a snake at the front end and with stable teams and velocity that's based on relative sizing, we can be plus or minus 20% in being able to draw that watermark for what we can get done by such and such a date, 3 or 4 or 5 months in the future. And the side effects, whether it's snaking or poker, to Doug's point, it delivers massive shared project understanding in just 3 to 4 hours. It surfaces experience and expertise from members of the team who say, yeah, I know how to do that. I did that in my previous company. I know where there's technical debt there. That's harder than you think. It engages the whole team in its work. And there's a 99-cent book that the late Steve Bachman wrote called Practical Estimation that's worth looking at for how to do that technique. Just note that when I do executive trainings, I make them do work task breakdowns first on one fruit before we do relative estimating at 12. And it's very eye-opening to executives of why we do relative sizing and not work task breakdowns. The bottom line of relative sizing is imprecise but adequate for the product owner and with velocity for predictability. And it has beneficial side effects of team sizing and in chartering, it delivers shared project understanding, as Doug was pointing out, and it surfaces experience and expertise and engages the entire team in its work.
So takeaways from tonight, don't just do Agile. Foster shared leadership in an Agile culture. Trust our people, shield teams from politics and distraction, remove impediments, empower self-organization and excellence, create a culture of communication and of psychological safety, and model and defend and evangelize Agile values. And then stand-ups matter, and stand-ups held daily and effectively matter most. Definitions of done matter, created within the team matters most, and created before you do the work matter, any of the work matters most. The fist to five technique can be very helpful for individuals with individual work to come together as a team to do their sprint planning meeting and during stand-ups. And effective pointing leads to effective estimating. Relatively sizing an entire 3-month plus backlog in 3 hours is a really valuable exercise. So retrospecting, I want to give you a Miro board to retrospect on that with a 4-quadrant retrospective. And let me grab that and paste it into the chat so that you can easily go there. And while you're going off to that Miro board and if it's not working for anybody, immediately unmute and tell me. I occasionally screw these up. But while you're doing that, I will point out that you may want to take a screenshot of this if you're interested in my book or the video training that's based on the book, because there are discount codes that you can use. And questions or comments?
I'll just say thank you, Ron. So I really appreciate it. I always learn a lot from your experiences.
Thanks, Mary. I recognize that voice. Here are a few URLs if you want to grab any of those. Screenshot of any of those. Leave that up for about 10 seconds and then I will return so we can look at each other. Other comments or questions about anything we've covered tonight?
Just helpful.
Thanks for all the content.
Yeah.
What was that?
I was going to say it's helpful to just hear it again and again, multiple times.
Yeah, for me too.
So, yeah, related to the team understanding of what done means, I had a revelation in one of our team meetings recently at my current company that the team did not have an understanding of what risk meant. And I know we're short of time, but could that be a subject of a future talk and/or article?
Oh, that's an interesting one, Andrew. So I want to point out that Andrew was the first manager I know to be leading a Scrum team in 2001, I believe, possibly 2000.
Yeah, I think it was before that. Ron was also the only manager who decided to take 2 tries of managing me before he gave up.
There is that.
Yeah. He claims I did not inspire that title, but I'm not so sure.
Other
When we worked at Schwab, risk was kind of very well defined, you know. We protected the assets if, like, for example, someone placed a trade and it did not go through, Schwab would make it right. whether they lose money or whatever. That was a definition of risk. It is how much will it cost us to quote make it right for the customer.
One of the things that I coach managers in. So another part of my consulting practice is coaching managers at all levels, more CTOs and VPs of engineering than anything else. But some of those are also first level managers when they're in startups. Coach them in listening to their gut, because my gut at one point, and it was a Schwab, my gut said there could be a potential problem here, and I ignored my gut 2 months, and then that problem was real. And it wasn't expensive to the company, but boy, it was expensive to me, because I had to drag in SVPs to sign off on letting us have a week to resolve that risk. And if I'd only done that when I first felt that in my gut, it sure would have been helpful.
I was going to say, risk management is still valuable. I don't know where, a lot of individuals think once they go into the Agile world, there are certain parts of management 101 and execution 101 that we don't do, which is not true. Risk management is still critical. You still have to do that.
Now, Raul, you were going to say something?
Yes. So in the estimation part of it, once we are done the estimation in the overall project, do you go back and estimate at the time of planning? Or we encourage them to do it, or is it we have to go through the number whatever it is assigned at the time?
So there's I want to answer that in two different ways. So one, we never while we're doing sprint planning readjust the points on a story, because if we do that, then we've suddenly got two vectors of relative sizing instead of one. And what comes through the end does not represent what's at the beginning, what's left in the backlog. So we need to not do that. Now there is a time when we do go back and look at our snake, and so one of the things about using mural for sizing is that Jira will populate a mural board with all of the stories. And so we can just put them in that, and then we can leave them there. We can come back and look at it again. With that one that was on the conference room table, we've got to carefully gather those and make sure that they don't blow away in the wind if we want to lay that snake back out again. So it's tricky. The one time when the time when we want to do that is, and I know almost no teams this is not true of, we've got new stories coming in. Yeah, Rob's shaking his head. Yes, there's a familiarity there. We got new stories coming in, and when our product owner says, "Ooh, that story belongs in the top 2.5 sprints worth of stories," and I don't know how big it is. Now, and I want to do this a week before, 3 days minimum before the next planning meeting, because we're not going to break the sprint to do this. It's not breaking production. But it's going to go into the backlog, and it may go at the top of the backlog, but we may need to make sure it's not teleportation. We need to make sure its ROI is good. So we're at the end of a stand-up, we'll declare another 5 minutes or 7 minutes, and we'll go to the mural board and say, where's the story fit in the snake? And the first thing, right before we do that, we'll ask, and based on the knowledge we have from what we've done, are there any stories, not that have the wrong point numbers, because point numbers is not the point. Is there any story that's not in the right place? Is there any story that based on what we know now, we know some now more about where technical debt lies. We know more about this kind of a story and that kind of a story. This story is in the wrong place. It's actually way easier. It belongs up here between these two stories. Belongs over there between these two stories. I think those two stories are 5, so that makes this story a 5 instead of the 3 that we had ranked it at.
And it's just a matter of making sure that is anybody uncomfortable with the story of the snake? And we'll do a go around. And then we'll take the new stories and put them into the snake. And if they go between 2 5s, it's a 5.
But do you suggest this exercise can be done every planning time?
So no, I never do it during planning times. It's a separate exercise that should be done during chartering for the product. We're
What
going
if the
to do the whole backlog for the product at the same time, and we do it up front. And we do it before we've got a lot of information, because we're not using our analytical brains, we're using our relative brains. It's just very counterintuitive for engineers. My engineer brain objected a lot to this. Jay, you're talking, but you're muted.
I'm gonna have to call an audible because we're over and we're recorded. And we're going to have more conversations. So in December, hopefully, we're going to talk about how to move from project to product and the different steps to do that and the architectural relevance around that. So I want to thank Ron. A lot of detail, a lot of cool stuff that we have to really take into consideration practically, and how to implement and everything. So thank you, Ron. Very cool. And of course, you can reach out to Ron. Ron will happily help anybody that wants help and come to your company and direct you in the right path. So thank you, Ron. Very educational. I learned a lot. I hope everyone else did too. So I'm going to cut it off now. Thank you for joining.